The money saved the ranch. Next winter would decide if it could last. They knew it before the first snow fell. The debt was gone, but survival had only bought them time. 1 season. Maybe 2. The ranch stood because Maeve's forge had carried it through, not the cattle, not the land, not the name Caleb had tried so hard to protect. The forge. And winter was coming again. Summer passed in constant motion. There was no relief in warmth, only preparation. The forge stayed busy through every long day. Orders came steady now, not desperate. People remembered what Maeve had done when the cold had nearly broken them all. They remembered the axles that held, the blades that kept their edge, the hinges that didn't fail when everything else did. Caleb worked the ranch differently now. The cattle grazed, but they weren't the center anymore. He counted coal deliveries instead of calves. He tracked iron shipments, not grass growth. The rhythms had shifted. The identity had changed. He didn't fight it. He couldn't afford to. Maeve reinforced tools in late autumn instead of fixing fences. She stockpiled materials. She tested welds twice. She prepared the way someone does when they've learned what winter really costs, not in money, but in margins. In mistakes you can't undo. In second chances you don't get. When the first storms hit in November, the forge never went cold. By December, the next winter arrived harder than the last. Roads froze early. Wagons broke often. The kind of cold that made metal brittle and would swell in the wrong places. Demand surged the way it only does when survival tightens its grip on a town. Axles cracked on frozen ruts. Blades chipped against frozen ground. Hinges failed under doors swollen shut. People came because failure wasn't an option anymore. Because being stranded meant freezing. Because broken tools meant empty tables. Maeve's name carried weight now. Real weight. Not curiosity. Not a novelty. Necessity. Orders stacked faster than she could finish them. Ranchers who used to nod politely now waited in line. They chose her work over Pike's bulk iron because hers held. Because she stood behind it. Because she fixed what others replaced cheaply. The difference mattered when winter didn't forgive shortcuts. Pike noticed. He didn't confront them this time. He didn't need to. He pressed suppliers instead. Raised prices on materials he controlled. Let freight shipments go missing for a few extra days. In town, he spoke doubts into the right ears, about safety, about capacity, about whether a woman and a failing rancher could sustain what they'd started. The same quiet tactics he'd always used. Just a different season. Different pressure points. The tension built slowly. No shouting. No threats. Just delays that cost time. Whispers that cost trust. Small fractures that could become breaks if winter pushed hard enough. Then came the contract that tested everything. A winter mining order. Large enough to matter. Time tight enough to hurt if it failed. Payment critical enough to undo months of work if they missed the deadline. The kind of opportunity that could stabilize them, or break them completely. Maeve accepted it without hesitation. The work started immediately. Days blurred into each other. The forge burned through every hour of daylight and long past dark. Caleb kept the operation moving, supplies rotated, coal stocked, orders tracked. But the weight of it fell on Maeve's hands. Her shoulders. Her will. By the 6th day, the cold worked into her bones. By the 8th, her hands shook from strain and old frostbite scars reopened. She slept near the forge to save steps. She worked through pain that would have stopped most people. And Caleb watched her force herself upright one frozen morning, and understood what the ranch really was now. If it stayed tied to one pair of hands, it would fail. Caleb saw it clearly that morning. Maeve moved like someone holding herself together through pure stubbornness. Her breathing was shallow. Her grip is uncertain. The kind of exhaustion that didn't fade with a night's rest because there hadn't been real rest in weeks. She was breaking herself to save what they'd built, and he'd been letting it happen because he didn't know another way. But there had to be another way. The ranch couldn't survive on her endurance alone. Not through this winter. Not through the next. They'd fought so hard to keep it standing, but standing wasn't the same as lasting. If Maeve collapsed, everything collapsed with her. The forge would go cold. The orders would go unfilled. The reputation they'd earned would scatter like ash. That night, Caleb made the decision. He spent the reserve. Not recklessly. Not blindly. But deliberately. The money they'd saved, the small cushion they'd built through months of careful work, he put it back into the forge. Steel bought early before prices climbed higher. Coal paid in advance to guarantee supply. 2 workers hired before desperation forced them to take whoever was left. It was a risk. Real risk. The kind that meant if the winter order failed now, they'd lose everything. No safety net. No second chance. Total collapse. But doing nothing was a slower version of the same ending. Maeve didn't argue when he told her. She looked at him across the dim forge, her hands wrapped in cloth stained dark, and she just nodded. There was no relief in her expression. No gratitude. Just recognition. She understood what it meant. What it cost. What it risked. And then she did what she had to do. She taught. The 2 workers Caleb hired were ranch hands who needed winter wages. One had worked a forge years back. The other had only watched. Neither were smiths. But Maeve trained them with precision, not patience. She showed them once. Corrected them twice. Dismantled bad work without apology. Rushed welds were redone. Weak joints were scrapped. Standards were enforced. She didn't have time to be gentle. Winter didn't wait. The deadline didn't bend. The first days were rough. Mistakes cost them hours. Wasted materials. Tension ran high in the cramped space. But slowly, grudgingly, output stabilized. The workers learned to read the metal. To feel the heat. To match Maeve's rhythm without needing to be told. It wasn't mastery. It was enough. Caleb managed everything else. He tracked supplies, rotated inventory, and handled accounts. He made sure the workers had what they needed when they needed it. He kept the operation moving so Maeve could focus on the work only she could do. They functioned like parts of the same machine now, different roles, same purpose. The winter order progressed. Slowly. Steadily. The deadline loomed, but it was reachable. Almost. Then Pike made his move. It happened just as the order neared completion. Subtle at first. A road they used for deliveries suddenly became unsafe and was blocked for repairs. A supplier they relied on found reasons to delay shipments. Contracts Caleb had negotiated for spring materials were quietly withdrawn. No explanations given. No confrontations offered. Pike was isolating them again. The same strategy he'd used before, but refined. He wasn't trying to destroy them outright. He was trying to make them unreliable. To introduce enough friction that people would choose easier options. Safer bets. His iron, his terms, his control. The pressure built in the spaces between things. In delays that compounded. In doubts that spread. In the quiet realization that standing alone against someone with resources and patience might not be enough. The winter order was due in 5 days. They were close. So close. But close didn't count if they couldn't deliver. And Pike knew it. Caleb stood in the cold outside the forge and felt the weight of every decision pressing down. 5 days. They had 5 days to finish the order, transport it, and collect payment that would determine whether they survived the rest of winter. The work was nearly done. The quality was there. But none of it mattered if they couldn't move the materials. If suppliers didn't deliver the last components. If Pike's quiet interference succeeded in making them miss the deadline by just enough. Inside, the forge burned steadily. Maeve and the workers moved through their tasks with focus that came from repetition. They'd found a rhythm these past weeks. A system. But systems only worked when the pieces around them held. When roads stayed open. When promises were kept. Pike had made sure neither was guaranteed. Caleb had tried the old approaches. Negotiating alternative routes. Asking for favors from suppliers who owed him nothing. Offering to pay more for materials that suddenly weren't available at any price. Every door closed politely. Every excuse sounded reasonable. It was the kind of pressure that left no fingerprints. No proof. Just the slow realization that you were being squeezed until something gave. He could stay quiet. Keep his head down, hope they finished in time despite the obstacles. Hope the suppliers came through, hope the blocked road opened. Hope. Or he could do what he'd avoided doing since this all began. He could speak. The town gathered at Brennan's store most evenings. Not for any particular reason. Just routine. People warmed themselves before heading home. Trading news. Sharing complaints about the cold. It was where information moved. Where opinions formed. Where reputations were built or broken. Caleb walked there that night. The store was warm and crowded. Conversation paused when he entered. Not silence. Just acknowledgement. People knew who he was. Knew what his ranch had become. Some had brought work to Maeve's forge. Others still used Pike's suppliers. Most just wanted to get through winter without taking sides. Caleb didn't ease into it. Didn't soften the edges. The forge runs because of skill, he said clearly, to no one and everyone. Maeve Collins runs it. Anyone who wants honest work knows where to go. The words hung in the warm air. No pride left to protect. No pretense that the ranch was still what it used to be. No shame in saying her name carried the weight. It was plain truth spoken plainly. The kind of truth that either mattered or didn't. People looked at each other. At him. Some nodded slightly. Others frowned. A few shifted uncomfortably. Pike's influence reached into this room too. His suppliers. His contracts. His version of how things worked. But Caleb had said it where it couldn't be unsaid. He didn't wait for responses. Didn't argue or explain further. He'd done what he came to do. He turned and walked back into the cold. The next morning, something shifted. Small things at first. A rancher who'd been waiting on a delayed order from Pike's supplier showed up at the forge instead, willing to pay Maeve's price. A freight driver mentioned an alternate route that wasn't officially blocked, rough, but passable. Someone offered credit on coal without being asked. The community was answering. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But in the quiet ways that mattered when winter pressed hard. Routes changed. Credit extended. Supplies shared. The kind of support that came from people who'd watched someone earn it. Who'd seen work that held when cheaper options failed. Who understood that having a reliable forge nearby was worth more than saving a few dollars. Pike's quiet pressure started to crack. Not because anyone confronted him directly. But because too many people depended on something real. Because necessity outweighed loyalty to old arrangements. Because when survival was the measure, quality won. The winter order went out on time. 3 days of brutal work. Long nights. Hands that bled through wrappings. But it shipped complete, on schedule, with Maeve's standards intact. The payment arrived 2 days later. Caleb counted it twice in the dim ranch house, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that had settled into every part of him. The amount matched the contract exactly. No disputes. No deductions. No reasons to withhold. It was real money earned through real work, and for a moment he let himself feel the weight of what they'd accomplished. They'd met the deadline despite everything stacked against them. Despite Pike's interference. Despite roads that closed and suppliers that vanished. Despite working with hired help who barely knew the trade. They'd delivered, and now they had proof it mattered. But relief didn't come. Because the money wouldn't last. Because winter wasn't finished. Because one contract, no matter how critical, didn't change the fundamental problem they faced, the forge was still dependent on too few hands doing too much work. Maeve sat near the stove that evening, her damaged hands resting in her lap. The scars from old frostbite had reopened during the brutal push to finish the order. Fresh bandages covered the worst of it, but Caleb could see the way she held herself carefully. The way pain lived in the small movements she tried to hide. She'd pushed past limits most people never reached. But limits existed whether you acknowledged them or not. The body kept its own accounts. "We need to grow," Caleb said quietly. Maeve looked at him. Didn't argue. Didn't deflect, just waited for him to continue. Not just for busy seasons. Permanently. The workers we hired, they're learning. They're getting better. But we can't keep running like this. One big order nearly broke us. The next one will if nothing changes. Growth costs, Maeve said. So does staying small. She nodded slowly. They both understood the calculation. Staying at their current size meant staying vulnerable. One injury. One illness. One mistake could unravel everything. But expanding meant spending money they'd just earned. Meant hiring people they'd have to pay through slow seasons. Meant commitments they might not be able to keep. The two we have now, Maeve said after a moment. They're steady. Not skilled, but steady. If we keep them through spring, train them properly, they could handle standard work by summer. Can we afford it? Can we afford not to? Caleb looked at the payment sitting on the table between them. Money that could extend their runway. Buy them time. Or money that could be invested back into the forge, into building something that might actually last beyond the next crisis. The choice wasn't really a choice. They'd already committed to this path when they'd spent their reserve to hire help. Going backward now would mean admitting it had been temporary. A desperate measure instead of a permanent shift. We keep them, Caleb said. We pay them fair wages. We build this right. Maeve's expression didn't change, but something settled in her eyes. Agreement. Partnership. The understanding that they were choosing the harder path because the easier one led nowhere. The rest of winter would test the decision. Orders continued through January and into February. Steady work, not the surge of early winter desperation. Farm equipment that needed repair. Tools that needed replacing. The kind of regular demand that a forge needed to survive lean months. Maeve trained the workers through each job, her standards unwavering. Bad welds were still dismantled. Rushed work was still redone. But gradually, slowly, they began to function as a unit. Caleb managed the business side with the same careful attention. He tracked expenses, negotiated prices, built relationships with suppliers who'd proven reliable when Pike had tried to cut them off. The ranch's identity continued to shift. Less land operation. More manufacturing. The cattle still grazed the hills, but they were secondary now. Background. The forge was the center. Pike didn't disappear. His influence still reached through the county. His suppliers still controlled major contracts. But the absolute control he'd held before had fractured. Enough people had chosen alternatives. Enough people had decided that quality and reliability mattered more than convenience. February brought a different kind of cold. Not the sharp, brutal freeze of early winter, but the deep, relentless chill that settled into everything and stayed. The kind that made metal ache to touch and coal burn slower. The kind that tested endurance more than strength. The forge kept burning. Maeve's hands had healed enough to work, though she moved more carefully now. The workers had progressed from clumsy to competent. They understood the rhythms. They read the metal's color. They knew when to push and when to wait. It wasn't artistry yet, but it was craft. Real craft. Caleb watched the operation settle into something sustainable. Morning started with clear tasks. Materials moved efficiently. Orders filled on schedule. The chaos of those first desperate weeks had given way to routine. Not an easy routine. Not comfortable. But functional. The ranch house felt different now too. Quieter in some ways. Fuller in others. Maeve stayed there most nights, her small cabin too far from the forge when work ran late. They ate together. Planned together. Made decisions across the same table where Caleb's father had once decided everything alone. She belonged there. Not as helpful. Not as a necessity. As a partner. They didn't speak about it directly. Didn't name what had shifted between them. But it lived in the way they moved around each other. The way Caleb deferred to her judgment on forge matters without question. The way Maeve trusted his decisions on money and supplies. The way they'd stopped explaining themselves to each other because understanding had become automatic. Some evenings, when the workers had gone and the forge cooled, they'd sit near the stove and let the silence stretch comfortable. Maeve would flex her scarred hands slowly, working feeling back into stiff fingers. Caleb would review accounts, his pencil scratching numbers that told the story of their survival. "We'll make it through," she said one night. Not a question. A statement. Simple and certain. Caleb looked up from his ledger. "Spring's still weeks away. We'll make it through spring too." He wanted to believe her. Part of him did. They had money in reserve again. The forge was producing steady work. The worst of winter was likely behind them. But belief required trusting that nothing would go wrong. That Pike wouldn't find new ways to interfere. That equipment wouldn't fail. That demand wouldn't dry up. "You sound sure," he said. "I am sure." Maeve met his eyes. "Not because it'll be easy. Because we know how to do this now. We know what it costs. We know how to plan for it." She was right. They'd learned the lessons winter taught, the hard way, but thoroughly. They'd learned to prepare. To invest early. To build margin before they needed it. To share the load instead of carrying it alone. "Your father wouldn't recognize this place," Maeve said quietly. Caleb considered that. His father had built the ranch on cattle and land. On the idea that a man's legacy was in what he owned, what he passed down unchanged. The forge would have seemed like failure to him. Like giving up. Like admitting the old way didn't work. "No," Caleb agreed. He wouldn't. "Does that bother you?" "Once. Deeply. The weight of disappointing a memory. Of changing something that was supposed to stay the same. But that weight had shifted. Transformed into something else." "It used to," Caleb said. "But he's not here. We are. And this works." Maeve nodded. No judgment. No sympathy. Just acknowledgement that the past didn't dictate the present. That legacy could be rewritten by the people who lived it. Outside, wind pushed against the windows. Snow fell thin and steady. The kind of late winter snow that didn't accumulate dramatically but never quite stopped. The forge would need stoking in the morning. Materials would need checking. Orders would need filling. But tonight, they sat in warmth they'd earned. In a house that stood because they'd refused to let it fall. In a partnership that had formed through necessity and solidified into something neither of them had expected to find. March arrived with thaw and mud. The snow melted slowly, turning roads into thick channels of frozen slush that refroze each night. Wagons moved slower. Deliveries took longer. But the worst cold had broken, and with it, the desperate edge that drove winter work. Orders slowed. Not dramatically. Not dangerously. But the steady stream that had carried them through February thinned to a trickle. Farmers focused on preparing for spring planting instead of repairing equipment. Ranchers turned attention to calving season. The urgency that made people willing to pay premium prices for quality work eased as survival stopped being measured day by day. Caleb had expected it. Planned for it. But watching the slowdown happen still tightened something in his chest. The two workers stayed on. He'd committed to keeping them through spring, and he kept his word. But now they stood idle more often than busy. Maeve found tasks for them, maintenance work, inventory organization, preparing materials for when demand returned. Necessary work, but not profitable work. Money flowed out steadily. Wages. Coal. Materials. The reserve they'd rebuilt through the winter order began to thin again. We could let them go, Maeve said one evening. Bring them back when work picks up. Caleb shook his head. We spent months training them. Let them go now, they'll find other work. We'll be starting over next winter. If there is a next winter for us. The words sat heavy between them. No doubt, don't panic. Just practical recognition that the margin was thin and getting thinner. There will be, Caleb said with more confidence than he felt. But confidence didn't pay wages. He started looking for other revenue. Reached out to contacts from his cattle trading days. Explored whether the ranch could take on contract manufacturing for tools that didn't need Maeve's skill level. Small parts. Simple repairs. Work the trained workers could handle while Maeve focused on pieces that required her expertise. Some leads developed. Most didn't. The market for metalwork followed seasonal rhythms that couldn't be forced. Spring meant planting, not building. Summer would bring equipment failures that needed fixing, but that was months away. Pike sensed the vulnerability. He didn't attack directly. He never did. But word spread through town that the Collins Forge was struggling. That they'd overextended. That the winter success had been luck, not skill. Whispers that questioned whether they could sustain what they'd built. Whether the smart money was in going back to established suppliers who'd been reliable for years. The whispers found ears. A few regular customers started going elsewhere. Not many. Not enough to be catastrophic. But enough to notice. Enough to matter when margins were already tight. Caleb heard the talk at Brennan's store. Heard his ranch described as a risk. Heard Maeve's forge called that experiment out at Collins' place. It burned in a way he couldn't quite name. Not anger. Something closer to frustration that the work they'd done, the winter they'd survived, could be reduced to gossip and doubt. He wanted to respond. To defend. To make people see what they'd accomplished. But Maeve stopped him. Let them talk, she said calmly. Words don't change what we built. Work does. She was right. She was usually right about these things. But being right didn't make the slow bleed of customers any easier to watch. April came with warming days and cold nights. The forge stayed operational but quiet. The workers maintained equipment and completed the few orders that came in. Caleb managed accounts with increasing care, watching every dollar, calculating how long they could sustain the operation before hard choices had to be made. They'd survived winter. But survival came in layers. The cold was gone, but the test wasn't over. The ranch had changed too much to go back. The forge was their identity now. Their livelihood. Their future. It just had to last long enough to have a future. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. A freight company representative arrived in late April with a proposal. They'd been watching the forge's output through winter, and noticed the quality. Noticed the reliability. They needed a regional supplier for standard hardware, hinges, brackets, fasteners. Consistent volume. Long-term contract. Lower margins than custom work, but guaranteed income. Caleb and Maeve reviewed the terms together that evening. The contract would keep the workers busy through slow seasons. Would provide baseline revenue they could count on. But it would also lock them into production quotas. Would require maintaining inventory. Would mean less capacity for the higher-paying custom work that had built their reputation. It's stable, Caleb said. It's limiting, Maeve replied. They both understood what it represented. Security in exchange for flexibility. Predictability in exchange for opportunity. The kind of compromise that kept businesses alive but sometimes kept them small. We take it, Maeve decided. Build the foundation first. Growth comes after stability. Caleb signed the contract the next day. The work started immediately. Production orders. Specifications. Delivery schedules. The workers thrived on the clear structure. They could handle standard hardware without constant supervision. Maeve trained them on the patterns, checked quality regularly, but didn't need to oversee every piece. It freed her to focus on the custom work that still came in. The complex repairs. The specialized tools. The projects that required her particular skill. The forge began operating on two levels, volume production that sustained them, and craftsmanship that distinguished them. May brought warmth and the first real signs of recovery. The freight contract provided steady income. Custom orders increased as farmers needed equipment repaired before the full planting season. The workers had fully integrated into the operation. The forge ran efficiently without Maeve needing to carry everything herself. Pike's whispers continued, but they lost force. Hard to argue a business was failing when it was clearly functioning. Hard to call something an experiment when it had lasted a full year and was still expanding. The community's response solidified. Not dramatic support. Just consistent patronage. People brought work because they knew it would be done right. Because deadlines would be met. Because Maeve Collins stood behind every piece that left her forge. Caleb watched the ranch settle into its new identity with something close to peace. The cattle still grazed. The land still held value. But the forge was the center now. Undeniably. Permanently. One evening in late May, as light stretched long across the hills, Maeve stood at the forge entrance and looked out at the land around them. Caleb joined her, both of them quiet in the cooling air. Your father built something that lasted generations, Maeve said. You built something that might last longer. Caleb considered that. His father's ranch had been impressive. Traditional. Rooted in a way of life that worked for decades. But it had been fragile too. Dependent on markets and weather and circumstances beyond control. One bad season had nearly ended. What they'd built was different. More diversified. More adaptable. The forge could weather storms the cattle couldn't. Could adjust to changing needs. Could grow in ways land never would. We built it, Caleb corrected. Not me. We. Maeve glanced at him. Something passed between them in that look. Recognition of partnership that had become more than business. More than survival. Something neither of them had words for but both understood completely. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting everything in gold. The forge behind them ticked as metal cooled. Smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney. Tools hung organized on walls. Materials sat stacked and ready. Everything in its place. Everything earned. They'd survived the test of winter. The test of change. The test of letting go of what was to build what could be. The ranch stood. The forge burned steadily. And for the first time since his father died, Caleb believed it would still be standing when next winter came. Summer came with long days and steady work. The forge found its rhythm. The freight contract kept production constant. Custom orders filled the gaps. The two workers operated with confidence now, their skills refined through months of repetition and Maeve's exacting standards. They weren't masters, but they were craftsmen. Real craftsmen who took pride in what they made. Caleb managed the expanded operation with careful attention. Tracked inventory. Negotiated prices. Built relationships with new suppliers who'd proven reliable. The accounts told a story he'd once thought impossible: the ranch was profitable. Not extravagantly. Not without constant work. But sustainably. The kind of profit that came from something built right. Maeve's reputation spread beyond the immediate county. Freight drivers carried stories. Satisfied customers recommended her work. Orders came from towns 2 days' ride away. People are willing to wait for quality. Willing to pay for work that lasted. Pike's influence faded to background noise. He still controlled certain suppliers. Still held contracts with established operations. But his grip had loosened. The forge had proven itself beyond doubt. Had earned its place in the community through work, not words. Through winters survived and promises kept. By August, the ranch barely resembled what it had been. The forge occupied space that used to hold cattle equipment. Materials stacked where hay once stood. The sound of hammers on anvils replaced the sound of herding. The workers came and went on schedules. The operation ran like a business because it was a business. The cattle still grazed the hills. Fewer than before, but present. Caleb kept them partly from habit, partly from practical sense. Diversification mattered. But they were secondary now. Land second. Forge first. The hierarchy was clear. What surprised him was how little it hurt. He'd thought letting go of his father's vision would feel like failure. Like betrayal. But it felt like survival instead. Like honoring what mattered most, keeping the ranch standing, keeping the land in family hands, even if family meant something different now. Maeve worked beside him through those summer months with quiet constancy. They'd settled into partnership so completing it required no discussion. Decisions made together. Burdens shared equally. Success and risk were divided without calculation because the division had become natural. Some evenings they sat on the porch after the workers left, watching light fade across land that had tested them both. They didn't talk much during those moments, and didn't need to. The silence held understanding that words would only dilute. Next winter, Maeve said one night, her scarred hands resting easily in her lap, "We'll be ready." Caleb nodded. They would be. They had materials stockpiled. Workers trained. Systems proven. They'd learned winter's lessons thoroughly. Had paid for that education in exhaustion and risk and moments when everything nearly broke. But they hadn't broken. They'd bent. Adapted. Changed what needed changing and held firm on what mattered. The forge would face next winter with strength they hadn't possessed before. Not hope. Not luck. Preparation. "We'll be ready," Caleb agreed. The ranch stood around them in the gathering dark. Solid. Earned. Built on work and partnership and the willingness to let something die so something else could live. They hadn't been saved. No rescue had come. No miracle had intervened. They'd survived because they'd planned for winter and met it together. Because they'd recognized what was failing and had the courage to build something different. Because when the choice came between preserving pride and ensuring survival, they'd chosen survival without hesitation. The forge burned steady through summer nights. Would burn through autumn, would face winter again when it came. And they would face it together. Not as rancher and smith. Not as an employer and hired help. But as partners who'd earned their place through seasons that tested everything. The story didn't end with promises or romance or easy resolution. It ended with a forge that worked. Land that held. And two people who'd learned that survival wasn't about holding on to what was, but building what could last. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories from the Wild West where survival meant more than just strength, it meant knowing when to change. There's another story waiting for you right here. Thanks for listening.